Now that each one of us has spent some time thinking of how they would conceptualize a session in which they're trying to address a specific problem, let's go through a more detailed process of planning, specifically considering the learners that we have in mind and how the learning experience that we are designing would be able to cater to all of them. The intention of this session is to articulate all the assumptions that go into the planning of our sessions, to point out various choices made in order to make sure that the session works to achieve what we want to achieve, and to also introduce certain theories about ways in which people learn and ways in which learning experiences can be designed so that we know how to make them relevant and they don't remain only at the level of theoretical knowledge. So let us begin by identifying why we need to design this particular learning session. Let's say we've got a course that comprises 12 lectures which are delivered by professionals in the discipline. Let's imagine that this is a course catering to students of furniture design, and each one of the lectures brings in an expert, a specialist, a practicing professional who comes to talk to the students about their own practice. This is a wealth of experience that we're talking about, something that the students could really benefit from. So, how do we ensure that this is happening? The problem that we have identified, either we as former tutors of the same course or from the experience of a tutor before us, is that the students are not making best use of the opportunity. It appears that they are not reflecting enough on what the experts are telling them. They are not using the learning from these sessions in their studios, in their internships, in their practice. So then, how do we address this? The first thing to ask very clearly is, what do we know about the problem? The temptation very often is to continue with unquestioned assumptions. Things like, oh, the students don't care, or they never care about mandatory courses, so we can't expect anything better. But what happens if we don't allow any unquestioned assumption to move forward? And we say, what is it that we know? What did we notice happening when the course was held the first time around or in a similar course earlier on? For example, we notice that the students are perhaps copying their assignments from designers' websites. They are asked, for instance, to submit an assignment for mid-sems or for the end of the semester, and instead of thinking and writing in their own words, what they're doing is to just go to the same designer's website and to take from there the introductions to their projects, and they submit that as if that's what they got out of the lecture. We might also notice high levels of use of AI or high levels of plagiarism either from the internet or among the students, and we notice that the students are not reflecting enough. Now, if this is the case, and if we are the same people who conducted the course earlier on, we may also have access to information such as we've got the same 2 or 3 people asking questions in every class. So, within the lectures themselves, the students are not engaging with the professionals or they're not engaging sufficiently. Now, if we know all of these things, the next thing that we do is to analyze. What are we doing? We're asking ourselves, what are the possible explanations for what seems to be going wrong? If it is possible to get back to the students and to ask them honestly, point blank, what is it that was happening, it would be ideal to do that. Sometimes it is not possible to do it. And then what we do is to go with the most likely things that are happening in this learning situation. We notice, based on all the things that we observed, that it would appear that the knowledge input is taking place. So the experts are coming, they are delivering what they're supposed to deliver, they're talking about important things. This is input going to the students, but the students don't seem to be acquiring knowledge. Now, this might be caused by a number of factors. One, what if they're not paying attention in class? Is that a possibility? Is it possible that they're not paying attention to the 1 hour or 2 hour session when someone is talking to them? Second possibility, what if the students are not really understanding what's going on? What if they're missing out on points being made and they're not asking for clarifying questions? Third thing that might happen, what if the students would understand things better if they were a little prepared? If they knew that a particular expert is going to come and talk to them, for instance, about the use of, say, valsaritique, if they already know the qualities of the material, then they may ask more pertinent questions, or it may be easier for them in the session to understand what the expert is talking about. The fourth possibility, what if everything makes sense in the lecture, all is good, they understand it all, they're even prepared, but they forget what they have been taught about? What if there's so much happening in their lives, so much happening in studio, that it's not possible for them to remember what an expert was talking about? So while they may have enjoyed the lecture, the ability to make use of the knowledge transmitted through it is minimized for lack of retention. And finally, what if they were in the lecture, they paid attention, they asked questions, they remember what was taught to them, but they're not able to see how all of this applies to them, they're not able to reflect, or maybe they just have not taken the time to do it. All of this still concerns with whether the knowledge conveyed by the expert has been acquired. But there is another level of analysis which is looking at whether this knowledge can translate into a skill or ability that the student is actually able to use. So it's all good and fine that an expert talk about valsaritique. It's all good and fine that they talked about a particular kind of joinery, but can I implement this when I'm working on my own design in the studio? Will it even cross my mind to use the knowledge that this expert gave me and to say, okay, let me try this as well? What if the problem is that the knowledge is not actionable? So in that case, what can be done for the transfer to take place? What can be done for the student to perceive where this knowledge might be relevant? But also, what can be done for the student to feel that they are equipped to take this idea and implement it? Do they feel that they are able to do this left to themselves on their own? And finally, are we as tutors providing tasks which encourage the students to demonstrate this transfer of knowledge? Now, all of these are big questions. How do we address them? Let's say we try to do this. We try to have a tutorial before the first expert lecture in which we introduce strategies to help them engage actively with the expert lecture itself. So our aim then is that by the end of the tutorial, our students should be able to extract significant content from the expert lecture, and then they should be able to integrate it in a relevant way into their existing knowledge or learning or professional concerns. Yeah? This is our aim. The easiest and most intuitive way to do that would perhaps be to say, all right, let's go to class, let's have a tiny tutorial, and let's tell the students, here are a bunch of strategies that you can use in order to process the information that comes to you better. And then they can take those strategies, they can take this knowledge, and they can use it themselves on their own. For instance, such strategies would be ways to identify and record significant content in the lecture. So how do you know whether what the speaker is saying is really essential? How do you write it down? Or how do you make sure that you remember it? And then strategies to retain this knowledge and apply it. Each one of these has its own ways. We are aware of them. We know how to do it. The only question is communicating this to the students. Yeah? Now, if we do this, if we go to the tutorial and we give these materials to the students, we have taken one important step. But then what we are doing is similar to what the experts are doing. We bring our knowledge to the table, we impart it, and then we expect the students to know how to apply it, to know how to make sense of it on their own. It is good, but it is definitely not enough. If we keep in mind everything that we know by now about the ways in which people learn, what happens, what doesn't happen, where the pitfalls are, then we might actually come up with a better plan for this session. For instance, what if we have a tutorial process in which we plan to use a 12 to 15-minute video to simulate the lecture experience? So we're not just giving people tools, but we're saying, let's imagine we are sitting in an expert lecture. Let's go through this together and let's see how we can approach this problem. What we're doing in this case is to already make sure that we're pulling the attention of the audience, because we're using a video and we know that watching a video is something that most audiences enjoy doing. What we're also keeping in mind is the level of difficulty. So we choose a video. In my case, when I did this experiment, I chose a video called The Dangers of a Single Story, which is linked here. Because it is not very difficult, because it is interesting, because I know that I can count on this to hold the viewer's attention. Then I decide that my session with the students will begin by introducing an experiment. I will divide the class into two. Say I have 20 students or 40 students. I'll divide this into two groups. I will give one half a very brief introduction to the speaker. This is nothing fancy, nothing complicated, but the kind of thing that they themselves would find if they just Google the name of the speaker, and the first thing they come up with, a Wikipedia entry, is what they read. That is it. So one group has to work for 5 minutes, but it's not very difficult work. The other group will have 5 minutes of free time. It's not a lot, it's just 5 minutes. Why am I introducing the session through an experiment? Because I know that Kolb, for instance, ever since 1975, has been talking about how much more effective experiential learning is for students. He's been talking about how there is a process of experiencing something, reflecting on that experience, then trying to apply the outcomes of the reflection, experiencing again, reflecting on it again, and how this cycle enables the learner to have more control over the knowledge that they are gaining than if someone were to just go and tell them themselves. This theory of learning is something that has been found to be really useful, especially for studio learning, and in design education and in architectural education is still very often in use. So it has two advantages. One of them is that is a system of learning which is already familiar to the students. Two, that it has a long theoretical backing which tells me that it's likely to work pretty well. So with this in mind, what I have decided to do is to introduce the session through an experiment. The next part of the experiment, the next step, is to give half of the class one of the formal note-taking templates that exist. Either the Cornell method or the outline method, it doesn't matter which one of them I'm using, or the mind mapping method perhaps, because I know that I am working with visual learners. I give them this particular note-taking template. I don't do too much of an introduction because it is quite self-explanatory, but this is one of the strategies that I would have given to the students anyway. And what I tell them to do is to just read through it and use it instinctively in order to write down, as they listen to the lecture, what they think are the main points made by the speaker, and if they have any follow-up questions or ideas or thoughts, they should write those separately. Yeah? The reason for this is because while we think that listening to someone and pulling out content, information is something that happens intuitively, the best universities in the world, places like Princeton, places like Harvard, make it a point in their first sessions with the students to give them these tools, because these are not intuitive, everyone doesn't know them, everyone doesn't use them, so our students may actually not know that these ways of approaching a lecture exist. Once I have done this, as part of step 3, we watch the video together, the whole class, and what we do is to make sure that the students know to treat these 10 minutes or 15 minutes just like they would a lecture with an expert speaker. So pretend that this is not a video that can be watched again and again, but this is a once in a lifetime opportunity where they get to listen to the speaker who's in front of them, and then they will have a chance to engage with them. Again, because in effect it is a video, what I need to make sure of is that the level of difficulty is adequate. The students shouldn't struggle. So I will not choose a video that's dealing with, I don't know, nuclear physics, because that might be too difficult. I also need to make sure that the print is good, that the audio works well, and that the video has subtitles just in case the speaker uses English with a certain kind of accent that all students may not be able to listen to, or even to cater for the students who might have hearing impairments, who might find it difficult to process what the speaker is saying. One of the most important things here is to make sure that I, as a tutor, have watched this video any number of times and have very clear knowledge of it. Because in class, it is more important for me to watch the group, to see the points where they look confused, to see the points where their interest seems lost, to see the points where they laugh, to make sure that I take the pulse of the situation. The fourth step of the session that I designed for my learner is one that entails turning this active listening that they have done into their perceived relevance and into an opportunity for reflection. So I'm not asking them directly to reflect on what happened in the session, but I'm asking the students to do what they would do in an expert session. Ask questions of the speaker. Imagine that the speaker is standing right there in front of you, and tell me, what would you ask them? And what I do as the students articulate their questions is to note down what they're asking. I need to make sure that I collect questions from all the groups. The groups who read the introduction to the speaker and took notes, the ones who read but did not take notes, the ones who did not have an introduction but took notes, and the last ones who were not prepared for the session in any way and who did not take notes during the session. I keep their questions separate because I will need them later on. But as the questions are being asked, we need to keep our eyes open and to ask ourselves, who is the first person to ask a question? Is there an initial reluctance? Does my student group need encouragement? Do I need to tell them something like, don't worry about what you're asking? There's no such thing as a bad question. No one will judge you for it. Do we need to set rules that say, please don't laugh when someone is asking something? These questions come from a space of vulnerability. We do this because we are also aware that there are any number of theories of learning that are looking at the social context in which learning takes place, and that are looking at how my background compared to my peers' background will influence my ability to speak in public, to ask a question in public. My relationship with my peers, my experience of them as being more or less judgmental people, will make me more or less reluctant to volunteer a question. But we also know that these habits of asking questions and sharing with each other need to be developed. So from my tutorial itself, I will start building in mechanisms by which my group of students, including me, is learning together, is consolidating meanings together. So with my eyes wide open and making sure that I address all these aspects, I collect the questions that people have asked so that in the next step, we're able to analyze together the nature and the quality of the questions. Now, this stage is what is called meta-learning. What is that? That is learning about how we learn. So, it is not enough for me to say, oh, you've asked a question? Good question. Now we need to sit together and very carefully say, is this a relevant question? Is it picking on a relevant aspect from the lecture? If it is, excellent. What makes it relevant? How do we know it's relevant? If it is not picking on a relevant aspect, if it's going off on a tangent, we must ask, why is this happening? Is there a point during the lecture where I got caught up in my own thoughts and then I did not pay attention because I was focused on my own understanding of what the speaker was talking about? Is the question focused on one of the last things the speaker said? Is that happening because we're not able to remember anymore what was said in the beginning? We're not able to capture the lecture as a whole. So the last thing that was said is the last thing that stays with me, is the last thing that I ask a question about. The moment we go through this, what we're doing is, as a group, to identify what makes a good question, how a good question is asked, but also to look at us as learners and identify our abilities. What this does is to build our sense of self-efficacy. So if I know that in general, I tend to ask questions about the last thing that was covered in the lecture, perhaps I can set a target for myself to make a note of something that took place beforehand so that I am not compelled to ask only about the last thing that happened. This is also part of applying a theory that is focused on what is called the zone of proximal development, which is identifying where I am as a learner right now and identifying how I can move one step farther than this, so I can take advantage of the knowledge that is available to me. But we'll talk about this a little bit later. Because in the next step, what we're going to do is something that is more individual focused, where we will ask each student to think about it and answer a different question. What do you think the speaker aimed to convince you of? What was the larger point that the speaker was trying to make? And how did they convince you of that? What points did they make? Did they try to convince you of their argument logically, or did they do it by appealing to your sentiment? This will allow each one of the students to write down for themselves what they think before the discussion begins and before their opinions are formed by interaction with other people. Now, this is part of the same theory that is looking at zone of proximal development, which requires us as tutors to be able to take stock of where each student is. What are they able to do? With how much ease are they able to do what we need them to do? Like, for instance, demonstrate accuracy in their comprehension, be able to remember something that was spoken over 15 minutes and still make sense of it as a whole, be able to remember it even after half an hour after they have spoken about something else. Now, the way this is processed is later on to collect answers from all the students, but not just jot them down and say, okay, you think the speaker tried to convince you of this, fine. You think the speaker tried to convince you of something else, also fine. That is not accurate. So if we want to make sure that our students are accurate in their understanding, we need to be able to very sharply point out where they went wrong and why they went wrong. For instance, some of the most frequent problems that are found are situations in which the students missed out on some part of the argument. So they think that the speaker tried to convince us of something, but they forgot an entire half an hour of the presentation, right? So if that is the case, then they need to be told, yes, you are right about this part of the lecture, but remember that there was something else as well. There was another part to this argument. So if you bring these two together, what does this tell you? If this kind of very focused, very meaningful conversation takes place, then what happens is that the student moves one step from where they were initially into where they ought to be in their accuracy of comprehension. They also move on in their meta learning because they will now be able to understand that they weren't entirely accurate. They got something right, but they could have gotten it better. And they are able to see how to get it better. Right? Now, all of this has to be consolidated. Yes? The things that we noticed did not go quite right in the student's understanding Like, for instance, distinguishing between what the lecturer thinks and what they themselves think, which are very common things to occur. This is the best opportunity to consolidate our conversation, to draw these distinctions, to define terms very clearly, because it's only once this meta analysis is done patiently, slowly, and is done together that the students will be able to carry it forward into our next assignment. And by doing this again and again, so by repeating this process, by going through this experiential learning in which we do and we analyze and we do and we analyze, we're building a common vocabulary, and we are at the same time increasing the student's sense of self-efficacy. So we would end this kind of a tutorial by spending 10 minutes in which each student talks to the person next to them about the relevance of the lecture to their own professional life. We introduce this discussion-based mode here and not earlier on, because talking about relevance requires more brainstorming, requires more ideas to come from the outside, something to jolt your mind even when you feel that you are stuck. So by doing this, we're also acknowledging the fact that in addressing the idea of the zone of proximal development, the next step does not always have to be taken with a tutor, but it can be taken with a peer or with a collective of peers as well. And in fact, theories of learning show that very often the person who has a little bit more knowledge and who can support the process of learning is a peer much more than a tutor. Learning through peers, with peers, ends up being much more effective, much better for a learner and for their self-confidence and for their self-efficacy than learning with a tutor themselves. And once we do this, and people have had time to discuss and reflect a little bit, we close the discussion. We never leave the classroom without closing the discussion, without wrapping it up, without consolidating. And we set up for the future by asking for a reflection which captures what they have discussed. It's not a big deal, it's not difficult to do. It's 150 words, it can be written in 10 minutes. The students could even sit right there in class and write it down and finish it off before they forget. But it is absolutely essential to capture the learning so that the learner is able to retain and transfer what they got out of this session. And finally, because we don't want to leave things here, we make sure that we set up a plan for transfer via follow-up. So the moment we have received the 150 word reflections, we make sure that we provide feedback to each one of these reflections immediately. Because if our students have put in work and we don't put in commensurate work, that work will go to waste. They will not have a feedback mechanism to tell them, yes, you're on the right track, no, you're not on the right track. And they will not have an acknowledgement of the effort that they have made. Now, the same process will have to be followed in the lecture with the actual expert. The same reflection note, the same feedback, in order to make sure that what we introduced in our tutorial is actually implementable. So with this, we followed through the logic of setting up a tutorial, using everything that we know from learning theories. If you found these learning theories useful, please feel free to go through the detailed reading materials and let's discuss them more, and also bring them into your own planning of sessions as and when you think that they are useful.